Companies often talk about having a culture of collaboration, integrity, respect, or innovation. More than 80% of big companies in the US and the UK have identified their corporate culture or values, with the same words cropping up again and again. But often employees are unaware of these values, think that the stated culture doesn't represent what actually goes on in the company, or consider the whole exercise little more than marketing. So is there really such a thing as corporate culture? Does it matter? And how can leaders change the culture when it goes bad? Welcome to The Big Question, the monthly video series from Capital Ideas at Chicago Booth. I'm Hal Weitzman, and with me to discuss the issue is an expert panel. Luigi Zinagles is the Robert C. McCormack Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance and the Charles M. Harper Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. He's the director of the Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State and the author of the books Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists and A Capitalism for the People. Amanda Sharkey is an Associate Professor of Organizations and Markets and the William S. Fishman Scholar at Chicago Booth. A former management consultant, she's an economic sociologist who studies how social and cultural factors affect organizational behavior and market outcomes. And Alain Cohn is a postdoctoral scholar at Chicago Booth. His interdisciplinary research brings together economics, finance, and psychology to study firm and employee behavior, investment behavior, and honesty. Panel, welcome to The Big Question. I want to start with a very basic question. Amanda Sharkey, what is corporate culture?
So corporate culture is basically a set of shared assumptions or values that employees in a company have in common. And so we think of organizations having, say, a strong culture when those values are extremely widespread and deeply held by employees in the organization. And we can think of a lot of examples of this. So kind of a classic one that people talk about when they talk about organizational culture is Southwest Airlines. So if you go to their website, you see they have a values statement around having fun, working hard, serving the customer. And all of those things kind of play out in a variety of ways in terms of they have an employee magazine where they talk about kind of employees that have gone above and beyond. They have awards for customer service. So all of these things are kind of symbols and signals of their organizational culture. And you can kind of contrast that with other companies in that same industry that may not focus as much on that same set of core values.
Just to be clear, is there a distinction between values and culture, or are they basically the same thing?
I would say that values are part of culture. So to me, values are kind of a set of deeply held beliefs, norms about what's appropriate to do. I think another aspect of culture is simply kind of a more cognitive component. So it's about how you see the world and kind of what is actually out there and what things you don't see because of kind of the cultural lens you may have on you, which isn't necessarily about what's the appropriate behavior, but it's about kind of what the world is.
Luigi Zinagles, does it make sense to talk about companies having a culture as opposed to just societies having a culture and companies existing within those societies?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with Amanda. Is a combination, culture of a company is a combination of values and expectations. Not only companies have it, even groups. Within the business school, the finance group meets at 1:20 and is very punctual. And you go to other groups and not as punctual. And is a set of expectation that people have, and they sort of coordinate on that. And I think is very important to cultivate. What we don't understand fully, at least I don't understand fully, is how to form and maintain those cultures. The fact that they exist, there's no question to me. How to create them and maintain them, that's a more challenging question.
But we also raise an interesting point there, which is within an institution, you can have several different cultures operating. So you talk about the finance group and other groups, you didn't name the other groups, but the other groups that do not meet promptly at 1:20. But, within a company, you might find that, the sales department is terribly organized or shambolic, but very creative or something. Another group is much more professional or thinks of itself as more professional.
Absolutely. There are the subcultures within a company. So you want to analyze what is the overriding principle or what is the subculture within each group.
It does beg the question, is it more about the individuals within that group, or is it, where does the culture come from?
I think that, first of all, there is an element of selection. which is very important in companies. Chicago is a fairly sort of a tough place to be, and if you, it's not for the faint of heart. So people don't join the group if you are that type. And two is assimilation. So you see the example. I think that in the finance group, the leading example is Jim Fama. He's always there on time. The only time he was late 2 minutes is the day after he won a Nobel Prize, and was late by 2 minutes. So I think that gives you a code. And if you are a new guy joining, I'm not a particular punctual person, but I learn over the time that if I don't show up there, I don't get my seat. So I better sort of hurry.
So I think an important question is why corporate culture matters for companies. And I think an important thing is that it's a key determinant of a firm's reputation. And I think many people would agree that this is the most important asset of a firm. So for example, Warren Buffett just recently wrote in a memo to the manager at one of his companies that we can afford to lose money, even a lot of money, but what we can't do is to lose reputation, even a shred of reputation. So I think it just makes it much easier for everyone in the company if the company has a good reputation to perform better. Like it's easier to acquire new customer. It's also easier to negotiate good deals with other companies and so on. Now,
but that's interesting again because you're tying reputation to culture. Are those two necessarily tied?
Yes. So the reason why culture is very closely connected to a firm's reputation is because a firm's reputation is like a public good. So it's individually costly to contribute to a good reputation to the firm, but everyone benefits from a good reputation. So it makes just life easier working there.
I think that reputation is culture is not just a way to deal with reputation. That's clearly important, but it's also a way to create an incentive scheme that cannot be designed properly with normal incentive, monetary incentive. So, for example, I think a lot of employees, especially on sales, have an interest in trading off, compromising on quality to make the sales of the last quarter. So, how do you sort of restrict that in a company? You create a set of value, and of course, you also punish or reward people based on those values, and they become part of the overall system of incentives of a firm.
I completely agree with Luigi. So we live in a world of incomplete contracts, which means that not every aspect of behavior can be monitored and enforced or incentivized. And so this is where culture comes into play. It tells employees exactly what they should do in these situations.
Right. Okay. So it's kind of it sort of acts as an overarching framework for behavior. But you talked about Luigi Zinagles. You talked about you put in place a culture. I mean, does it just work like that? You just declare. Lots of companies declare these are our values, and there's a gap between that and what actually happens in the company, right? So where does that culture come from?
So first of all, it's not enough to declare and you have it. In some of my research, I look at what people with company declare on their website and then what seems to be going on in the companies, and the correlation is not that strong. So I think is not as simple as that. I think that I'm stating the obvious, but one thing is leading by example. It says, if you see at the top of the organization following certain principle, that was the Jim Fama example. He sort of lead by example, and people follow. The other thing is, of course, hiring and firing based on that criteria that will reinforce the culture of a place.
Amanda, Sharkey, to what extent do individual leaders then shape the culture of an entire company?
So I think in a small firm, an individual leader plays a big role, just because it's a smaller group. That leader can sort of have hands-on contact with everyone in the organization, and so can really inspire them to act in a certain way. But as organizations get bigger, the way that I teach my students about this is that there are kind of two levers of putting in place a culture. One is around employee selection. So when companies say that they're hiring on the basis of cultural fit, this means that they're kind of taking into consideration what are the company's core values and how well does that employee fit with those values. The other big lever is socialization. And so this is around basically training or inculcating people with what the organization's culture is. And that happens in a variety of ways. So I would think about kind of the very visible awards that companies put in place for people who are kind of high performers, the type of stories they tell. So one of the cases that I teach in my class to students at Booth is about a company that's known for great customer service. And they tell this story about the customer service rep who stayed on the phone for 12 hours, which is obviously not an efficient thing to do. But the point of it is that it kind of drives home this idea that customer service is really important. So I would say it's kind of these stories, these symbols, and kind of signals of an organization's culture that really are the ways that it's carried throughout the organization.
That's fascinating, though, isn't it, the example you give, because there must be cases where the values are meant to be one thing and the way they get transmitted is entirely different. The example I think of is Body Shop, where people said to Anita Roddick, well, surely we're here to do good. And her response was, well, not really, we're here to make profits first. We can do good afterwards. So is there a danger there that the transmission of the culture can go, or the values can go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, in any time people are sort of transmitting a message from one to another, it's kind of like playing a game of telephone, and it may not necessarily get transmitted correctly, but that's why it's important for an organization to have kind of multiple symbols of the culture, so that these can all be kind of consistent with one another, and so it's not completely reliant upon one individual message being correct.
Luigi Zinagles, Amanda Sharkey talked about when companies grow, it's harder for the leadership to kind of spread the values around. And obviously, with really big companies, they're operating, multinationals are operating across different kinds of national cultures. So if you're running a company where you have one factory or facility in Japan and one facility in Italy and one facility in Russia, those are, obviously there are going to be very different practices. How do you enforce a kind of corporate culture across national cultural boundaries?
I think it's particularly difficult when you merge different companies. Managers I talk to suggest that if you grow organically, it's relatively easy to maintain a culture even when you go in a different environment, because the selection component and because the socialization is more slow. If you sort of buy a company in China today, it's very difficult to transmit those values to China overnight. And so I think that a lot of companies are worried about what happens in other countries because they're not sure that, for example, the culture of integrity, etc., translates equally in different countries.
But to what extent do companies reflect their national cultures? Because some of your research suggests that you can actually look at companies as a kind of microcosm of societal culture.
That's definitely true. I think that, of course, people carry their habits from where they come from. I always tell people in Italy, but it's not the only country, in high school, you have to let other people copy your test. If you don't let them, you're considered a scumbag. So collusion in cheating is sort of standard in some countries, and in others is absolutely not. So I was talking with people that inspect companies in India. They were shocked at the fact that the bankers will sort of back up the company in a lie, and they were completely taken back by this fact. And you have to understand that the collusion is very different, and the source of cooperation takes place more among employees against the boss than other ways. So that's an important consideration. However, even when you go to companies like countries like this, if you select and socialize properly, you can have very different culture. And in fact, precisely because you go to countries where the standard norm is different, you can select a tail of the distribution and have a very strong different culture within an organization.
Okay. But it represents a big challenge for globally active banks. So, for example, there was last year, Citibank just lost a lot of money because their branch in Mexico issued fake loans to oil companies. So it's very important that the leadership actively manages and ensures that the values also in branches in other countries where countries different than the headquarter, that people that they comply with the norms of the company.
Yeah, but this is where I think the leadership is important and how you implement it. A CEO once told me, when I send a memo, nobody really believes what I say until I fire somebody on that memo. Because I have to say, unfortunately, a lot of companies these days send internal memos just to cover their behind in the case of a scandal. They said, oh, there was a memo in place, there was a procedure in place. Employees are smart, they understand immediately if that procedure is just designed not to be followed or to be followed. And I think that once you start punishing people because they don't follow, then they comply.
Okay. Alain Cohn, as a researcher, how do you measure culture?
Well, there are different approaches. So in our research, we used an approach based on the economic theory of identity. In this theory, it is assumed that people have multiple selves. So for example, you have an identity as you have an occupational identity, and you have a family-oriented identity, and so on. And these different identities are tied to a set of norms that prescribe how you should behave. Now, depending on which identity is more salient in a given situation, determines which norms you are more likely to follow. But there are also other ways how to measure norms. So you cannot just directly ask employees because it is unlikely that you get honest answers. But what you can do is to ask your employees what they think, but most other people would think whether it's appropriate or not. And so this is like one way how to get honest responses, because you don't ask them directly about their own behavior or what they think is the right thing to do, but what they think most other people in the company or in different branches.
They don't have integrity, but clearly I do. Amanda Sharkey, how do you deal with this question of measuring culture?
So in my own research, I've looked at annual reports and gone back in time about 50 years or so and looked at kind of how many pages they devote to discussion of the company's history, their culture, kind of their core values, and have seen sort of a dramatic increase in the amount that they talk about these things over time. And that probably segues into some of Luigi's research about how meaningful this is. But I think it does suggest something about kind of the business landscape and the type of things that we think are important for organizations to have to look like a legitimate business. And having a culture and a statement of values is something that is kind of, you must do it these days.
The norm. But where does, so that's a culture in itself, is having a statement of your culture. But where does...
So that's part of it. I mean, I think the question then is how deeply felt that is. So in my world of sociology, we talk a lot about the idea of whether or not an organization has a strong culture or a weak culture, and that's essentially how much consensus or buy-in there is to that culture among the employees. So it's not just what are they saying, but it's are they actually walking the talk? Are employees actually perceiving that culture?
But you ask them directly.
Some people do. So I haven't, in my own research, I haven't, but that's one approach to it.
Okay. But if you're looking at over time, you said that the more and more pages devoted, where does that come from, that change? Is it from customers? Do they expect, the companies they work with or buy from to have a statement of their values?
So the way that we think about it in our research is not that it's maybe so directly tied to customers, but it's kind of more of the broader kind of cultural zeitgeist, I guess. So we look at it as going hand in hand with kind of a broader shift in society towards people having kind of a sense of authentic self, and this idea of having self-fulfillment being kind of a cultural value that's become more and more widespread over time. And so this idea of organizations also having a culture and trying to tap into or trying to motivate employees by aligning their sort of ways that they get fulfilled with that culture is something that we
But just to be clear, you're not saying because there are more pages, there's more culture. now than there was 50 years ago?
That's hard to say. I mean, we'd have to go back in time and actually be on the ground with these companies and know what their culture was like. But I'm saying that it's become kind of an important thing that businesses do, that they at least say they have a culture, whether or not they are actually putting this into practice. It's something that is kind of it's a widely accepted piece of management now.
Okay. Luigi Zinagles, you said earlier that you had found a big gulf between what employees think really goes on in companies and what companies say goes on in companies. So tell us a bit about that.
So in one piece of research, I follow the second strategy that Alain was mentioning. So get answers of employees of how much they think their management is trustworthy. And it's not particularly correlated to how much companies emphasize integrity, but it is correlated with company profitability. So it seems, this is a correlation, it's not a causation, but it seems that there is this positive correlation between how much you think your managers are trustworthy and how valuable and profitable your company is.
Okay, and so to actually have that culture, not just to talk about it, makes you a more profitable company.
Yes.
Okay. If they didn't state the culture, would there be any difference there? If they just
from the evidence, it doesn't seem to matter. But we're back to the question. It's a more difficult question. How do you make sure that this culture is shared within the company? And I think that on issues like the integrity of management, I think the experience is everything. You can't just proclaim, we're going to be honest. People see you on the job and they ain't fair.
Okay, which leads to the question of how do you turn around a culture when it's not quite where it wants to be? And Alain Cohn, you've studied the banking industry and you've found that, in fact, the whole industry has a culture, not just the company, but this whole industry, the people who are in it are not inherently dishonest, but when they get into the banking industry, their behavior changes.
Yeah, so we indeed found that the bank employees in the control condition were surprisingly honest, which is a fact that wasn't really mentioned in the popular
press. When you
press.
say surprisingly honest, you mean more honest than the average?
More honest than every other subject pool we have investigated so far. And when we ask the general population to predict the behavior of certain groups of people, people thought that bankers are more dishonest than criminals. So the perception of these people was very different to their actual behavior. But I have also to say that our study was not really intended to measure the selection effects. So its design was not it doesn't really allow to cleanly identify whether bankers are very honest in their everyday lives or not.
Okay, but you did find there's something about the culture there in that whole industry that leads people to behave in a different way than they might otherwise do.
Yeah, so we activated the occupational norms through rendering the professional identity more salient. And we did that mainly with one large international bank, but we also replicated the results with several different banks. And actually, I just got an email that a different group of researchers replicated our results with a bank in Greece. So it seems to be something that is not specific to one particular bank, but rather widespread within the industry. And it's maybe not so surprising because there are many factors that can affect culture and that are also likely to be affecting all companies within an industry. For example, market forces. If during the financial crisis, the institutions were struggling and they had like a mentality of having the backs against the wall and winning was everything. And so this is like one way how the environment can affect every single company within an industry. But of course, every business unit has a different culture and companies also have different cultures.
Okay. But Amanda Sharkey, when it comes to the question of how do we actually correct this or improve culture in a certain industry or in a certain company, you found that actually something as simple as ranking companies on their behavior can have a big effect.
Mm-hmm. So when I think about corporate culture, one of the things that I think is really important about it is that it kind of harnesses the power of peer effects. So if I think that Luigi is going to show up on time to the meeting. Well, I better get there on time as well. So the way that we studied kind of this idea of peer effects and culture was looking at a bunch of companies that were newly ranked on their environmental performance. And sort of a straightforward incentive story would be that as soon as I'm a company that gets ranked, I'm going to start improving my performance because I don't want, I don't want social movement activists coming against me. I don't want shareholders to think that I have old technology. And so that's kind of a straightforward incentive story. What we looked at was how firms responded to the fact that their peers were ranked. And so was there this spillover peer effect that when more of a firm's peers are ranked, they then reduce their emissions as well? And we found that
even if they are themselves not ranked?
Even if they themselves are not ranked, we found that those firms weren't necessarily changing, but the ones that were ranked, so it's kind of the conjunction of themselves being ranked and the peer effect, those things kind of operating together. So the effect of being ranked is much stronger if a bunch of my peers are also affected. So the idea there is that we're basically kind of copying one another's behaviors, and that's kind of a powerful incentive to change behavior.
Which, I mean, leads directly into your research about industries, because presumably if industries start behaving in a different way, then it can be a positive cycle.
There's also strong movement of employees to different companies. For example, when the Glass-Steagall Act was removed in 1999, so banks started to integrate investment banking into their business, and so they hired the investment bankers, but then they moved around. So it's clear that they brought a certain culture into the bank, which then spread out to the rest of the bank, to the other units like retail banking or so. And because then they were fired, or like they took their clients because they got a better offer from a different bank. So then their set of values then spread to different companies like a virus.
Right. Or a good virus. A good
virus.
I mean, presumably in some industries there's more crossover in that sense than there is in others. So we've talked about ranking, we've talked about leadership. Luigi Zinagles, what about the structure of a company? Because you talked about the public companies can be focused on profits. They can be focused on the short term. Does being private actually, could that be a good thing in terms of corporate culture?
So what my research shows is that, again, there is a correlation between being a publicly traded company and having your employees perceive a lower level of integrity. And the question is why that's the case. And our hypothesis, which is at this point is just an hypothesis, our hypothesis is that once you get listed, you care more about what is reflected in the stock price. And now, some other researchers show that the culture of integrity seems to not be fully appreciated by the stock market. And why? Because once you are listed as one of these top companies, it takes a while for your return to catch up. It's not an immediate announcement effect. So this is a suggestion that the market does not fully appreciate these values, maybe because they cannot be measured so precisely like earnings. And so if that is less important in the stock price, it's going to be less important in the company because the company focuses more on the stock price.
So in certain cases, it could be that private companies have a better corporate culture.
It could.
Okay. So it's interesting because you'd think that the transparency of having to report to the market and that kind of thing would actually make the culture better.
You hope so, but I think there are some countervailing forces.
People often find that the employees don't even know what the corporate values are supposed to be. So if you actually tell people more about them, the more you tell people about them, does that make a difference? Or building your training around enforcing them?
There absolutely has to be communication around corporate culture, but I think this is a case where actions speak louder than words. So actually seeing what types of behaviors are rewarded in the organization, which types of people get promoted, which are sort of seen as like the standout, the high status folks in the organization. I think that tells us a lot about what the culture values, probably a lot more than just having a CEO say a few words
about it. Make a big statement.
But if I may add, I think that the role is our role as educators in shaping this culture. Alain's research, which is very, very beautiful, shows this identity component And I think that we are part of shaping this identity component. So when we take and say that is rational to commit a crime when sort of expected benefits of the crime is bigger than the expected cost, we are implicitly saying it's irrational not to commit a crime in that situation. And irrational is not exactly a good term. So what most people say, it's moral. Says being moral when it doesn't pay is not really being moral, it's being smart. But being moral is not do something that is in your interest because of some bigger principle. So implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly, we are communicating to our students that is irrational to be moral.
Okay. So
but companies themselves should focus on having a code of conduct, for example, that has clearly defined set of behaviors that are acceptable or not. And I think what Luigi's work also shows is that many companies have some form of a code of conduct, but employees cannot really relate to it. So they cannot really translate what's written in something that is maybe 400 pages long to their daily business. So I think it's very important to have to say it in concrete terms what is expected for them, what is the right thing to do, what is wrong, and also to explain to them what their externality can be of their behavior. So I think many employees don't understand that if they do something bad, that it affects other employees at the firm as well.
Okay, so be very specific in the kinds of actions that
Yes.
integrity actually means X, Y, Z.
And also to use maybe reminders. So we are actually conducting a study, or planning to conduct a study to test the effectiveness of ethical reminders. Once they had a ethics training, or they took like an oath, like it happened in the Netherlands, where they promised to behave well, whether such a measure could be effective in raising ethical behavior.
We look forward to the results of that investigation. My thanks to our panel, Luigi Zinagles, Amanda Sharkey, and Alain Cohn. For more research, analysis, and commentary, visit us online at chicagobooth.edu/capideas, and join us again next time for another Big Question. Goodbye.